Doesn't look like we have too many people, so I'm okay with having, kind of an open discussion. There's the raise your hand feature here on Teams, which is cool. But yeah, we are recording, and tonight I want to talk to you about Azure Synapse Analytics. Now, I come from a background, a little bit about myself. I am a Chicago native. My bread and butter is with SQL Server, database engine from the bottom up. I mean, I love the internals of SQL Server, um, performance tuning, optimization, then database design, infrastructure, all the way up to large, big kind of scale out scenarios and high availability disaster recovery. Anything and everything SQL Server is what I've been working with, and I love it. Um, but lately, there's been kind of a more of a move towards big data and analytics. And I think that's because in general, people are collecting lots more data. They have more data. And with the advent of data science, I should really say maybe the explosion of data science, because it's not new, but the idea of instead of taking and collecting data that we want to create a report with, and that we probably already kind of know the outcome of that data and we're just putting it out into graphs. Data science is maybe saying we've got all this data and we don't even know what we don't know. We don't know what we want to look for. So let's use science to maybe come up with some hypotheses or just look for patterns in these large amounts of data that we've been collecting. And that's where Synapse Analytics can be really helpful. The other place I personally see Synapse Analytics being very helpful is in places where I have large amounts of data that might be from disparate sources. And I'll give an example of this in a minute. But where we don't need to access it or analyze it. So one of the things that you'll see here that we can do with Synapse in conjunction with a storage account and data lake in Azure is we can go and we can store a whole bunch of files that maybe for compliance reasons we need to store for a year, 7 years, right? But we very infrequently actually need to access those files, let's say audit data. But when we do have an auditor come in and they ask, hey, I need to see this invoice from this date, right? Or I need to see a copy of a database from this date, or an audit file from this date, right? Now we're accessing a very, very small percentage, but we want to be able to do it quickly so that we're not wasting our precious time getting this data, right? And that's another place where I see Synapse Analytics being helpful because we don't have to spend the money on storage. And I'll talk about this because the example that I'm going to use is audit data, right? A lot of companies collect audit data. I used to collect native SQL Server audits from all of my servers on everybody who logged in. And we also did any DDL changes to the database so that we know who made a change. Any security changes, those are all audited. But the reality was we didn't need to access that data very frequently. And if we were to store it somewhere, you may know that many audit files, because they aren't just plain text, because if they were plain text, somebody could easily change them. They're stored in some type of encoded binary format that requires some other tool or function or program or library to read. And so they're relatively large as a file, right? You don't get to determine which columns you pick or anything like that. So you kind of get a lot of this data. So there's a way, and I'll kind of talk about that as maybe as we go through this, where you can use Synapse Analytics to simplify that, right? And make it very, very cost effective. So that's kind of, that's a really quick kind of discussion about why I want to talk about this. So, and my background again is OLTP, some analytics workloads, but primarily in SQL Server. So this is kind of out of my comfort zone. So I might not be able to answer any like detailed questions about Python code, but I will talk to how Python, Scala, and all that stuff can be used here, right? Many of you, if you've used any big data, you're familiar with Parquet and maybe even Avro formats. But we can also see here how SQL Server is going to work, and that's what I love about Synapse. So let's kind of jump into this. This is a really good description that is from us at Microsoft. Not only I think is this meant to be a little bit of marketing hype, but it really does summarize Azure Synapse. So I'm going to read it word for word. Azure Synapse Analytics is a limitless analytics service that brings together enterprise data warehousing and big data analytics. And that's key. That's one key sentence there, right? It brings together data warehousing and big data analytics. Okay, and you'll see what I mean by that. It gives you the freedom to query data on your terms using either serverless or provisioned resources. Okay, so what does that mean? We're going to talk about that, but that's really cool too. Okay, and then Azure Synapse brings these two worlds together with a unified experience. Another keyword, unified, and then ingest, prepare, and manage. Right? So this is what this does. And then we finish it up with business intelligence and machine learning. All this in one product? Yeah. And really the idea here is it's a workspace, as some of you may be familiar with using Databricks, right? So we're going to have a workspace where we can use all of these tools, manage them, develop, and do everything in a central location. And since they're all hosted in Azure and can all feed off of Azure Service and Key Vault and the security that Azure services bring, it's really easy to connect all these things together, which is my favorite thing. Because if anybody is familiar with Databricks, sometimes setting up security to lakes or to external data stores can be a little bit of a pain, especially if you don't want to expose those keys. And the other thing is you're mounting drives and stuff like that. Whereas here you'll see there was something called linked services. Right, so let's just jump into this a little bit.
Well, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you say you can unify all these data sources. What if some of your data sources is on global cloud or AWS?
In many cases, we have connectors that will allow you to tie into those. Yep.
Ah, great.
Yeah, so we'll see that, and you'll see that there's a whole bunch of connectors out there. I can't go through them all, but I know we have some for AWS, for just as an example that you brought up. So,
but Synapse itself is hosted on Azure.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so Synapse isn't like an engine, right? Synapse to me is really a unifying platform. You could think of it as a wrapper or a container for a number of different services, or at least maybe even look at it as a way to access a number of different services in one place. And that's why you see here it's a platform, right? So all in one place, we can set up our data integrations. Okay, so basically what we have is something very similar to Azure Data Factory. Or SSIS for some of you that are used to that, and you'll see how that works. But we've got our data integration. We've got our different runtimes. So we've got SQL, which would be our Azure SQL pool or Azure SQL serverless. Serverless meaning that you're not defining some sort of, full-on compute power related to memory as data warehouse units are in a SQL pool. But we do have the massive parallel processing of Azure SQL, of what used to be called Azure SQL Data Warehouse, which is now an Azure Synapse SQL pool. We've also got the ability to set up Spark clusters, much like you would do in Databricks. Okay, so we've got these provisioned things. We've got on-demand. What you're going to see, and I'm going to show you the on-demand. On-demand is really good for exploratory analysis, right? So in data science, you may want to just take a quick look at your data first to see what it looks like, so that you can develop your structure and develop your plan better. The other thing is, for me, it might help me with schema. It might help me to certainly to demo, and I'll show you some of that tonight. Now, the languages that we can use here in the Synapse platform between notebooks and queries and stuff are SQL, so native SQL, because the SQL pool is built on something very similar to the SQL database engine, right? You can use Python or PySpark. You can use .NET, and you can use Scala. And now one of the cool things I think about this is the .NET, because coming from working for a lot of companies in the past, and of course now Microsoft, I worked in a lot of companies where they write code in .NET. And so to be able to get some of those developers that aren't necessarily data scientists to be able to write code here is really nice for all those companies that are basically, using .NET on a day-to-day basis. And all of this is kind of wrapped into this experience, right? Which is the Analytics Studio, which is basically a workspace that allows you to do all these things. And you can publish from that workspace. So anything you do, what you'll see is like if I write a SQL script, I'm going to publish it and it's going to be saved there, right? And either I can access it or other people can access it. It's really cool. We can even set up a DevOps pipeline if we wanted to, where things can go through source control and then be published. So with all of these things sitting there on the platform, I need ways to access them. And so through the Synapse Analytics Studio or the workspace, we can manage these things. We can create them. We can set them up. We can configure them. We can manage security to these things, to the workspace through the workspace. We can also monitor these things, which has historically been a real challenge in Databricks for me. And then finally, there's this idea of a metastore. Metastore meaning that I can spin up a Spark cluster and access, because the metadata is part of this workspace, I can access, if I have the right credentials, I can access my SQL data warehouse. And vice versa, I can create an external table to something that might be contained in my Spark pool, right? So because we've got a unified meta store of all of these services together in this particular workspace, they all know about each other. So this is really cool. Okay, so we've got a number of sections here, and I'm going to speed probably through a lot of this because it's a lot to cover. I don't know that I'll cover Synapse Link for Cosmos DB tonight, but if we get there, I will talk about it. And there's going to be, if not already, a number of different, what they're going to be called link for to Synapse for different services that are offered in Azure. Okay, and we'll talk kind of about what that means when we get there. But let's jump into the studio. So the slides that I have here will show, I don't like that I duplicated this. We're going to go through the experience. And these slides were put out here when this was in public, when this was in preview and not GA. Well, guess what? It's GA. So I figured it's probably better just to jump out and show it to you. Oop. Right, so let's do that. So the first thing I'll show you is that in Azure here, first I go out and I create a resource for my analytics or my Synapse workspace. And I could do that pretty easily. If any of you have worked here in Azure, I go to create a resource, and all I have to do is search for Synapse. And when I do so, I can go here and say Azure Synapse Analytics, click on it, go through the wizard to create my workspace. I already have one here. And so when I go to my dashboard and I go to my resource group and I click on, which I'll show you down here, you can see that the type here shows a Synapse workspace. And if I scroll over here, this is the name and the link to my workspace. Right here. So all I have to do is click on that resource, and then I'll get the URL to my actual studio. I can click on Open Studio here, or I can click on the workspace web URL. If I wanted to save this or copy it or give it to somebody else that's going to be working there, I could just copy it from here, click on the clipboard, and then go ahead and paste it there and go. Right now, this is all tied into Azure Active Directory, which means it's got role-based access. So I can give people the privileges that they need to do the work that they need. And I can give them the privileges to the workspace, and those credentials can be passed through to the different services. So they may not have access to a particular storage account, which means they won't be able to access the data there, right? And that may be the way that I want it. Maybe I want them to not have access to that storage account and only to the ones that they need to write their analytics or their queries against. Okay, so that's important. The first thing you'll notice in Synapse Workspace is this toolbar up here, right? And so there's like notifications. I can go and see updates, right? What's new in Synapse? What's some information that's going to be good for me? Here I can switch different workspaces if I wish. Here is going to be notifications. So I'm sorry, these were updates to Synapse. These would be any notifications that I may need to view, and I don't have any. Here's some settings, which is very limited right now. It's really just about language. So more will be added to this in the future, I'm sure, but it's pretty limited right now. I can get help or information here. And then finally, if I want to submit feedback. What you'll notice about Microsoft and Azure is it's following the popular kind of methodology now of release fast, release often. So there may be things here that are on the roadmap that you're not going to see that you want. You can give feedback, or maybe it's not on the roadmap, but you've seen it in some other cloud or some other service, and you'd like it added, and you could think it would help. And this may be a good place to give that feedback. So here on the home page, you'll see a number of different kind of click things you can get to. So right away, you can click on Learn, and this is going to take you to a place where you can start using some samples, browsing a gallery, which I'll show you a lot of for tutorials, right? Click back. Here you can visualize. So you can link to a Power BI workspace and link it directly into the Synapse workspace. This one will show you more about how to work with your data, and this one will perform a one-time or scheduled data load. So basically showing you how to use the orchestration function of Synapse. So there's just kind of a lot going on here on your home page. Once you get used to this, you may not use it as much, but this is a great place to kind of go and see what other people are doing in the analytics workspaces and how people are using it and stuff like that. Right, so just kind of a nice central location. You can even start, if you wish, you can go directly to creating a new SQL script or a notebook, a data flow, which is very similar, if not identical, to Azure Data Factory data flows. So this is more transforming your data is a data flow. We can create an Apache Spark job or a pipeline. And a pipeline, right, would basically be moving data with very little or limited transformation, but we might typically call a data flow within a pipeline if you're not used to that, right? Or we can import stuff. So I could import a notebook, right? I could import a SQL script that somebody else gave me. So there's a number of things you can do here. But as we go through this, I'm going to walk down the tab here on the side, which if you see, if I expand it out, we've got data, develop, which is where our scripts and our notebooks will be, integrate, which will be our orchestration, and so on. So let's start with data. So what's really cool here is that this is going to show all of the data sources that I have set up for access in this workspace. So there's two little tabs here, right? We've got workspace and we've got linked. So in my workspace, I have an on-demand SQL pool here. Okay, so this is not any type of reserved compute power. It's just an on-demand serverless SQL database. Right now it's empty. I don't have any tables in there. I have a regular SQL pool, which in this case is what used to be known as Azure Data Warehouse. Okay, so it's a massive parallel processing data warehouse which is built on column store indexes for the most part. And it also, the thing to know about, if you're interested in Azure, in the data warehouse portion of this, is it's basically 60 distributions. And if you know what column store indexes are, take that knowledge and multiply it by 60. And you basically have a start of an understanding of this. But it's a relational data warehouse, right? So we're building tables. Okay, and that is for structured data. But then what you'll see, the other thing I have down here is a Spark pool that I configured. Right now, it doesn't have any tables in it. Oh, yes, it does. I'm sorry, because I pointed this to some audit that I was working with. In this case, if you're familiar with Delta Lake, I've got a Delta Lake built on this table. So I'm not going to go into details on that. But the whole point of me showing this is that you can have multiple databases. If I wanted to, I could connect to a database that's outside of this workspace. So these are managed, right? These are what's managed here in the workspace. But I could link to something that's outside of this workspace. I could link to sample data sets. So this is a link to Chicago safety data. This is a link to some COVID tracking data. Okay, and all these are set up under the management section, but it's really cool. Here's some data lake storage, so basically a storage account. And this is where I'm storing all of my Parquet files that I built those tables off of over in the Spark section. Okay, but each one of these is part of this storage account. Right, I can look at my raw audit files that are in my storage account here, and I can manage all of this from this location, right? Manage access. Instead of having to leave this, go to the storage account and manage access there. I can do it from here. So that's what we're talking about with this unified platform. So let's see what else we can do. We can develop, right? So I can develop against this data. And what you'll notice here is I've got a bunch of SQL scripts. I've got some notebooks. Okay, if I want to add something, I can add more. One of my favorite things here is Browse Gallery. So if I go to Browse Gallery, I can find a number of notebooks that'll help me learn about stuff. Getting started with .NET for Spark, right? Read and write data from Azure Data Lake Storage. I click on that, I click on Continue. This particular one is Scala. And when it loads and I open the notebook, so I can preview it, now it's loaded the notebook into my notebooks. And if I publish it, it's there for good until I delete it, right? And I can make changes to it. This is now a notebook that's a part of my library here. If I jump back to this SQL script, this is really cool. Notice what it's doing. This is a SQL script that is selecting the top 100 from my data lake, right? And the format is Parquet. So I am literally writing SQL against Parquet files in a data lake, as opposed to having, you know, and I'm not as used to writing Python and PySpark in a notebook, okay? But in this way, I can go and run this. This is on demand, so it's not, I didn't have to start up my server. I'm not paying for compute sitting around. Oh, what happened? No, doesn't like it. Oh, maybe that's the problem. Try now. And there we go. There's some of my Parquet audit file. Now, what's nice is I did not know this. You know, I don't work with this every day. I'm not developing in this, so I don't know this syntax. But watch this. I jump back to data, and I know that I wanted to look at my audit Parquet. So here's what my Delta Lake or my data lake looks like, right? The data lake is just files. But what I could do is right click on this file, and I could either do a new SQL script, select top 100 rows, which I did, or I could create an external table. I could bulk load this data into something. I could create a notebook. and load it to a data frame. So I could do all this from here, and I didn't know how to write that. So I went to new SQL script, select top 100 rows, and there it is. Right? It did that for me. So there's a lot here that can help people get onboarded to using the system, to learning Python, Scala, SQL, and working with it through the system. Here's a notebook that I grabbed from those from the gallery, getting started with Delta Lake, because I knew that Delta Lake is a really fast way to work with data and keep it ACID transactions within a lake. And this walks you through how to do it. And I chose to do it in Python because I need to work on my Python. I'm really bad at it. So I chose to do it in Python, but there's one in .NET and there's one in SQL. So it just depends on which language you want to use. Getting started with Delta Lake, and you'll notice down here, it says PySpark. This one's Scala. This one's Spark.net, right? And then here's the sample data sets too. So just, I don't know, this blows my mind because because it makes my life easier. Especially somebody who is really at the beginning of his journey to data science and big data analytics. So I'm going to move down here next to the integrate. So integrate is now where I could build a pipeline. Something very similar to SSIS if you are SSIS people. I've got things that I can drop in here, right? I can copy data. I can access different services. I can, here's Databricks. So I can actually, if I already have an existing Databricks cluster and a notebook that's doing something, I can run a Databricks notebook and I can drag it out here, configure my source, and work with it, right? I can, if I need to give it a variable, right, set a variable, pass it in to my notebook, do some stuff there, and then eventually we are going to load this into maybe copy the data into an Azure SQL table, right, and do a SQL pool table. So I can do all of this here. And this is awesome. I can add a trigger, and my trigger can either be a schedule or it can be an event. It can be a tumbling window. So there's just a lot I can do here to trigger off my pipelines. Right? This is really cool stuff. So let me jump. I'm not going to publish this, which means it'll yell at me. Yeah, I'll just discard that. So then we jump down here and we have the monitor. And this is something that I think is really cool because I feel that when I was trying to work with Databricks, I know that there's a way to monitor Databricks, but it's not built into, at least not in detail, into the workspace. And so for me, not being somebody who's a coder and deploying jar packages and things like that, that can give you some really interesting monitoring for Databricks, it was really difficult for me to set up a monitor, especially something with like graphs and stuff that I could look at. But what's nice here is I can get all this information through my Synapse workspace. So I can look at my pipeline runs and I can debug them. I can look at my triggers. What has fired a trigger for my pipelines? My different integration runtimes, which are either self-hosted or Azure. Since this isn't a detailed talk on integrate or how we would use something like Azure Data Factory or integration, there's the Azure runtime, and then there's the self-hosted integration, which is something you might install on a on-prem VM so that Azure can talk to it and you can run SSIS packages and do some pretty cool stuff. Then you can get down here to activities like Apache Spark applications, SQL requests. So now we're monitoring performance. Right, and you can see my top one, but when I did that select top 100 here, so I can see the whole query right here. I can see how long it took to run. This is good information, right? Things that can help me performance tune my workloads and optimize my costs here in Azure. And then when we get down here, outside of the requests, I can actually take a look at some of the metrics around my resources. So in this case, I've got a SQL pool that is paused, okay, which is important for me because I'm not using it on a regular basis and I don't need to. And having 60 distributions in a massive parallel processing warehouse could be expensive. And so I pause that when I'm not using it. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the cloud, it's that paradigm in and of itself that gives the cloud its power, right? You run things and you have them on when you need them, and you turn them off when you don't need them. You scale them up when you need to scale up, and you scale them back down. I once had a customer come, he's like, we are paying for so much because our ETL process at night, it 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 needs all this power, and now we made a change and you're telling us that we need to add more power to it? How can we afford that? Well, how long does your ETL process run? Well, when it's at that high, when it's scaled up like that, it runs for an hour. Okay. And what do you do with it afterwards? Well, nothing. Why not? Are you telling me that you can scale it back down? Well, yeah. See, because the mentality of people traditionally on premises is we don't do that, right? We build something for the max that we need and we leave it there. But we don't do that in the cloud. And so these people ended up saving thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars by automating their scale up and scale down for when they needed it. Right. So that's just something I'm bringing to some of you if you're new to doing some of this stuff in the cloud. All right. So my SQL pool there, here's my Apache Spark pool. Same thing, it's going to be paused. It's not being used right now. So this is our monitoring, which is a really nice place to go and look for that. You can actually take some of the stuff and pump it out to log analytics if you wish, which you can create dashboards off of and use KQL. So if you have multiple workspaces and other services that you manage and you want to see them all in a dashboard, you can do that with Azure Log Analytics. But if you're just kind of working with your group of data scientists or analysts and you want to keep it here, this is a really good one-stop shop to come in and view what's going on. And then the last thing here is the manage. So here's where I might go and create a new SQL pool. Notice here it's got the option for system assigned managed identity. That's awesome because now I'm not assigning a service account. I am not giving passwords. This is all system assigned, managed identity, and Azure handles the authentication for these services. Same thing here, I can create my own Apache Spark pool. And what you'll see is if I go through it, this is very similar. If you're used to Databricks, it's very similar to that. I can pick my number of nodes. I can tell it to auto scale. I give it a name, right? And it's going to tell me the cost of it. So if I go in here and say this is my Chicago demo, pool, right? We can see as I scale this up how much I may spend per hour on compute. right? But that's auto scale, right? So this is very similar to Databricks. I can pick my version of Spark. I can have it auto pause after being idle for a certain amount of time. So I will have to wait for that startup cost the next time I use it, right? Or I can just disable it and leave it on, depending on how often you're using it. Now here is where the real power, I think, of the service portion of this comes into play. So what you'll see here in my linked services is that I've got an Azure SQL database. It was out there. I've got an Azure SQL database I created, I was working with, and then I thought I might want to see some of this data in my Synapse workspace. So I did. So I added it as a linked service. And now I can create a SQL script or a notebook and query data from this and pull it into my data warehouse if I need to. Or write it out to a Parquet file or Avro or CSV or JSON or something like that. Right? Imagine I want to monitor several SQL servers for something specific. I could create linked services and pull that data here. I can also manage, here's my sample data that I basically imported into blob storage. So 2 different blob storage locations. And if I go here, because I'm in linked services, I can see, right, where this is located. This is not my storage account. This is a public storage account. So anywhere where there are public URLs, you can connect to them and access the data and bring it into your system, right? The New York City tax data is a very popular data set for people learning to work in data science or analytics. And there's a public URL. So I could put that public URL in here and access it. Right?
What about the Chicago parking ticket database? That's always a fun one.
I don't know if it's in here. I could try to find it. Oh, this isn't going to take me to the gallery. The gallery's over on the other side. We'll take a look later. But here, Ross, to kind of answer your question, linked services, Amazon Marketplace web service, Amazon Redshift, S3, Apache Impala. Of course, we've got all the Azure Blob stuff, right? Cosmos DB, Data Lake, Azure Database, Azure Data, MySQL. So there are tons of different things you can connect to. Google BigQuery. So we've got the Google Cloud, Apache HBase. So all of these things can be connected to as a linked service. And so you can bring data from them into your workspace to work with. That's awesome, because once these are set up, if you're accessing keys through Azure Key Vault or using a SaaS token, or even just regular good old password authentication here through the linked services, once they're set up, you can reference them. Yeah, I know, Microsoft Access. Yeah, I know. It's funny. It's funny that you mentioned that, because I had a customer yesterday talking about migrating their Access applications to a newer version of SQL. And what they meant was they are still keeping the application in Access, which is horrible. But yeah, so we've got a ton of things you can connect to, and this is being added to on a regular basis. Okay. I want to say, so here you even got a generic protocol so that you can make connections to things where we don't have a specific connector. As long as they've got REST APIs, ODBC connection, OData, you can connect to them, which is really cool.
OData?
OData.
Yeah, that would be timely around March 17th.
So, so these are the linked services. You can see here that we can also now create a connection to Purview. If you're not familiar with Purview, it is Azure's data catalog. And it's really cool because not only does it function as a data catalog, but it can register new data. It can do data discovery and exploration for you. It's pretty cool. I don't have that set up yet. This is in preview and I haven't played with it enough, but Purview was announced at Ignite. And I think it's going to be a really nice complement to help us wrangle in all this data because there's just so much out there and we're going to be getting requests to work with it, work with it, work with it. So here's where we can manage our triggers for our integration. And then of course, security, right? So it's important, especially when we are going to have a lot of disparate sources of data, that we appropriate permissions according to the principle of least privilege. And so if you're not familiar with that, that means you don't give somebody more access than they need. And you don't give them, that doesn't mean that you can't give somebody more access when they need it. But standing access, and I'm going to kind of preach about this for a second because it's something that I'm passionate about, securing data, is you don't give standing access to somebody who doesn't need it, who doesn't need administrator access on a daily basis throughout the day, right? Then don't give it to them. If they might need it, hey, we've got an issue. Can you grant me administrator access so I can take care of it and dig into this? Sure. Right? And let's document that I gave it to you at this day at this time, and that I removed it at the next day at such and such time, right? Because that's going to become more and more important as we start to see more hackers trying to get into our systems, trying to take advantage of loopholes, right? It's huge. We heard at least part of the story right now from SolarWinds is that an intern had a bad password somewhere, right? Okay, why did they have access to even create a bad password, and why didn't we have somebody double checking this work and something like that? So it's all about these different layers that we can put in for security, and this allows us to do it. So we can do role-based access. I could add a role to somebody, and I can do it at the scope of the workspace or a particular workspace item, right? So I could choose something here within the workspace and give them access to it. Say a linked service. Right? And as part of that link service, I can pick which one I want to give somebody access to. So this is, we can get pretty fine grained here with role-based access, which is nice. We also have credentials. So credentials are identities that we can use to authenticate between services. And I can create credentials here to give to another service, right? Like I've got my SQL pool in here. What if I want other things to be able to access this? And then I can store any keys in my Azure Key Vault or certificates. Any secrets can be stored in my Azure Key Vault. So just another layer of security that I could use for services to talk to each other. You'll also see here manage private endpoints. I don't have an integration runtime that's using a virtual network, so I don't need that because right now everything is within this same workspace. And then of course I can configure it to use source control with Git so I can integrate with it. So anytime I'm updating my notebooks or doing development here and I publish it, I can publish that and commit it out to Git. Okay, so that's pretty cool too. So there's a lot here. I went through it relatively quickly for 45 minutes. one of the things that I wanted to, so in general, right, this is, people use something like this for analytics. And I get it all the time where people say, oh, we don't need that for what we're doing because, we're not doing machine learning or we're not doing predictive analytics. We're not analyzing petabytes of data. But let me take you a step back to something that I was talking about, right? Where I was managing a lot of data. I need to store it cheaply. And even though I want to be able to access it quickly, I don't need the compute available all the time, which is what I would get, let's say, in a database, right? For the most part,
Yep.
right? Azure SQL database. I'm paying for that database, even though I'm not necessarily using it. I'm just using it to store data. So I'm also paying for the storage on top of that. So from my standpoint, I don't need that. What I need is the storage, and I need it in a format that I can query easily, but I want to reduce the storage, right? The storage impact. Well, I started looking into that, and I saw that Parquet and Avro are two Apache licensed storage formats that are highly compressed. Okay, Parquet even more so. So I said, well, that's great. Well, how do I work with Parquet? Well, typically you work with it, in a Spark cluster or a notebook, right, with Python or Scala. Okay. So I started thinking, well, how can I do this? How can I do this? Um, and what I thought was, if I need to access this data, I mean, it'd be great if it was just sitting out there in storage, and all I needed to do was spin up, let's say a SQL database, right? And then I could do an external table. Well, it kind of works. Um, but a database, right, like a SQL database, um, even a data warehouse, I mean, then I would store the data in there, and that's not cheap. Because that's optimized for faster storage. Also, I mean, this isn't really relational data. It's almost, it's almost like just log data. So it's just one big kind of mass for the most part. Um, does it make sense to, databases are optimized for relational and kind of working with sets. I'm not really doing that here. So that's where the Spark cluster kind of came in to play, right? Because what I can do is I can stop and start it and just query that audit data or log data or performance data, click stream data on its own when I need to. And when I'm not, I'm just paying for the storage. But I'm not paying for the storage for the raw data, right? Because this is compressed. This is a highly compressed yet consumable format. And so in this case, I'm using something that ultimately was designed, right, for big data processing and analytics, but I'm only paying for it when I turn it on, and it's a modest cost for a small cluster. You guys saw that when I was adjusting the Spark cluster, right? It's pretty small, especially if you're only going to use it for a couple minutes to run a simple query. And with my notebook being available, maybe somewhere over here, I've already written the code. All I have to do is parameterize it, right? But I can go through, and once I start up my Spark pool, so I can go up here, and I think I go here, settings. And, oh, come on. I know there's a way to do this, and I'm just not familiar enough with it. Well, if I go in our, here's a nice thing about a notebook. You see, I've got it, I'm telling it to attach to the Spark pool. So this will start up my cluster for me. And once it does that, I can run through my notebook, view my data, and then stop the cluster. Okay. Or I can run it all. So this is all very helpful to me. Even outside of doing analytics, right? It's really big data though. That's what I'm doing. I'm managing big data. But I don't need the power of a data warehouse, and I don't need the power of a huge Spark cluster. All I need is a single notebook, a very small Spark cluster, and I start it up when I need it. And as I started going through this, I started thinking of even more use cases because I think the analytic stuff is something that's known and has many documented use cases, right? I mean, Databricks is big now, is really big. Um, but what about those kind of off use cases where I could really end up saving money and time doing this? And that's where I think um, having everything in one place allowed me to see this a little bit easier and think outside the box instead of having to think of, well, which services do I have available? And then I got to go pick this, right? So I don't know. I think that this is a really cool platform. Um, I hope this was a good introduction to it and to what it can do. Are there any questions so far? I don't know what your background is out there. Are you an avid Databricks user right now? Are you an avid um, Azure SQL Pool or formerly Azure Data Warehouse user, right? Do you have other data warehouse workloads that you're looking to move out here, or are you using this for something like um, data science? I do know too that there are plans, at least initially, there were plans to add um, at some point R and Java to the list of supported languages here. I know a lot of people are used to working with R in Databricks or just R Server, R Studio. Um, And so I think there is a plan still to put R in here. In my experience, I see R starting to kind of slide down a little bit, and Python has moved its way up the data scale. But I think it's all going to go. What organizations have familiarity with what? I see Jim saying he used Databricks, and he'll pull to ML Studio to use R. Yeah, and of course you integrate here with ML Studio, certainly for your integrations and running notebooks and stuff like that. So, you know, does this have all the same functionality as Databricks? I don't believe so. I think there's certain things that are proprietary to Databricks, even though it's built on top of Spark. Um, but the idea here is to give you another option and a place to manage it, because to me, managing everything here is just so much easier. And connecting the services together, it just works. Like that has always been my problem with multiple platforms, even Azure initially, right? If I were to go out here right now and if I were to create an old school Azure data warehouse resource and try to connect it to a Gen 1 data lake and then try to use Azure Data Factory to move that data, connecting all those things and securing them with the proper credentials and maybe even through a virtual network and stuff like that, for me is very difficult. Now, again, I don't do it every day. But there's just a lot of different things you have to do. Here it's so easy and it just works. Just works. Right? If you're used to Databricks, you'll see here, I am not mounting a drive. This, and you'll also see I am not using credentials to the storage account. Well, I don't need to because this is already a linked service. So it matches up the URL here with a linked service that already has secrets stored in it that are not exposed to anybody, which means they're not exposed in my notebook either. I've seen that all too often where people have their storage account keys in plain text in their Jupyter notebook or in their Databricks, notebook, because they don't know how to secure those keys. This does it for you. So now when I come here and I run this, it's going to automatically connect to that storage account, passing through my credentials because I'm the one running this. And it does that by default. There's other ways, but I wanted to use Azure Active Directory. So it's using pass-through credentials. And now I just read that data. So when I come down here and I run this cell, to count how many records are in my data frame. It's going to run the Spark job. And I can see the results. Oh, that's the header. I don't need that head. I'm going to do the count. All right, so it shows that I have 1,780 records in my data frame. So that's just, I don't know. For me, that's really cool. Any questions? Any comments?
Yeah, I've got a real basic question, but
Okay, I'll try to answer it. Hopefully it's basic enough.
it's what's a data frame?
Okay, so that's a good question. You can think of a data frame as like a result set that sits in memory. So whenever we're working in Databricks, Python, when we're using R and stuff like that, basically you're reading your data into a data frame, and that's what you work with then. Does that make sense? It's a
Yes, it
result.
does.
It's a result set that we pass through. So here is the I named my data frame DF. I could have named it something else, but ultimately now I'm referencing a count here of that variable that is my data frame.
Gotcha.
You think of it as a table variable almost, or a temp table. It's similar, right? Any other questions? Okay.
Well, this is good. A lot of information here.
Yeah, a lot of information because there's a lot going on. And and again, though, I'll say that there's always a lot going on when you're doing some of this stuff, especially pipelines and integrations and transformations and stuff. But now it's all in one place, and that's what gets me excited about this.
Yeah, one-stop shop.
Right.
I think it'll be huge once they get the be able to use Java.
Yeah, I think that'll be a nice addition as well.
Reason I say that is at my place there's a lot of Java.
Okay.
But there's also a lot of Python being used.
Python definitely has an extensive library set for the types of things that that we do in terms of analytics and machine learning and stuff like that. And I think that the Python libraries are just growing and growing. Um, you know, several years ago, I would have said, gosh, R is the language to learn. Like you have to know R. And now I say it's good to know R, but you have to know Python, I think, in the data science and analytics field.
Yeah, we got a question here. Savea, and forgive me if I mispronounce this name, Savea. But what is this develop link to do?
So are you talking about this tab here on the left that says develop?
Yes, that is what I am asking
Okay.
about.
Yeah, that's just navigating us to the develop kind of workspace. So this is where all my SQL scripts will be. If I click to data, you'll see this changes to my data sources. So here's all my data sources. Then when I go to develop, this is where I can create a new script, a new notebook. I can create a new data flow. I can browse a gallery to choose some sample scripts and sample notebooks, sample data flows, or I could even import one that I have changed, saved. So if I go to import and let's see, I can choose and this is local. So I go to a local file, and maybe if I had here's a Python notebook, I could import this.
Oh, okay.
Right. So it gives me or a SQL script, right? I could import a SQL script. And even so, and let me kind of tell you, like another thing that I'm doing, where I've got a customer who has an Azure SQL, a SQL pool, a Synapse SQL pool. I've got to remember how to say this. The Synapse SQL pool. Okay, so it is a data warehouse that is scaled probably mid-level. So I think it's like a DW 3000, and they want to monitor it. And they want to create some of their own dashboards. So what we're actually doing is something very similar to what you would do in a SQL Server database engine. And we've got an integrate that goes and runs a query on their data warehouse, pulls out the request information, copies it into an Azure SQL DB, where we can then create reports on it, right? So could they use Azure Data Factory in conjunction with their SQL pool, in conjunction with a SQL DB? Yeah, but it was a lot easier to manage everything in here. So I got my linked service to my Azure SQL DB, and I've got my SQL pool, which is already part of this workspace that I work in. And then I just created an integration pipeline that copied data into there. And now I can build my monitoring off it. So it's basically a monitoring data store.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Thank
Any
you.
other? Yeah, no problem. Any other questions? All right. Well, I guess with that, I'll wrap up and just say that I think Synapse Analytics is really cool. I'm going to be spending a lot of time in it because I am starting to learn PySpark and tying into some of the machine learning libraries that I can run in my notebook and develop some models, which I could then save out again to my blob store and trigger off some of those notebooks to run when needed. So.
Yeah, thank you, Jared. This is really great. Great information.
Yeah, you're welcome. With that, I know we've got our speaker next month, which is going to talk about indexing, which will apply, not just to SQL Server database on-prem, but of course to Azure SQL DB and to a degree even a data warehouse. I think indexing is always a good thing to understand. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. So feel free to join us next month, everybody.
Yeah, definitely.
Ross, do you have any? Go ahead.
Sorry, did I cut you off, Jared?
No, I was saying, do you have any final words to say? And if you want, we can stop the recording now. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, good idea. I forgot about that. As soon as I figure out how to do that. Oh, here we go. Well, I hit the button, but nothing's happening. Oh, here we go.